Chapter 23 discusses new industries for Southern California in particular. And we're going to talk about the oil industry and the movies. The oil industry had some rather august beginnings. In 1861, a guy named George S. Gilbert built a small refinery near Ojai in Ventura County, and he produced kerosene from crude oil that was simply seeping out of the ground. Stuff was bubbling crude, wasn't being pumped out. Additional wells were drilled there, but those wells didn't really produce at commercial quantities. Exploration was successful later on in what is today western Los Angeles County near the LA Ventura County line in a place called Pico Canyon, which you drive by on I-5 every time you go to LA. It's very close to Magic Mountain, actually, west of Newhall. Pico Well number one became the first commercial oil well in California in 1875, and other wells in that area soon followed. The Union Oil Company in California, which was formed by Thomas Bard and two other small operators in 1890, had success in finding oil in the LA area. But bigger than that, in 1892, Edward Doheny, yes, you've heard of the Doheny Boulevard, I think, Doheny Beach, whatever, in LA, that should be made, not mad, made a major discovery of oil within the city limits of LA, and the boom was on. As you can see by this picture, around 1905 in Los Angeles, there were oil wells in residential areas. Can you imagine that going on today? Um, Additional discoveries occurred in the Santa Barbara area and also in the LA basin. However, much bigger discoveries occurred in March of 1910 when a Union Oil subsidiary was drilling in Kern County, southwest of Bakersfield, resulting in, well, actually, it was the world's greatest oil gusher. It says in your textbook, one of the world's greatest, but it was the greatest oil gusher. In fact, I even heard a recent radio report that indicated that this oil gusher, which is called the Lakeview Gusher, which occurred near Taft, near Buena Vista Lake, was actually at least twice as big as uh, the BP Macondo well spill in the Gulf of Mexico in the spring of 1910. Excuse me, in the spring of 2010, a century after the Lakeview Gusher. So that's very interesting. By 1911, the Standard Oil network was split up due to a Supreme Court antitrust decision. At that point in time, though, the division of Standard Oil over here, called Standard Oil of California, had the largest refinery in the United States, located on the Pacific coast. By 1919, the Southern Pacific Land Company, which did dabble in oil, that's the ominous railroad we talk about so much in all these chapters, owned more than 19% of the proved oil land in California and produced about 18% of the state's oil. However, Southern Pacific Land later on divested of its land holdings that had oil. Other companies that popped up included Associated Oil, Shell, Richfield, General Petroleum, which became Mobil, the Texas Company, which became known as Texaco, and Doheny's Company, which was called Pan American. Now, I've been driving since 1968. I'm kind of old. And when I grew up in Sacramento, at the time I first started driving, gas was about, 27 to 29 cents a gallon. In LA, it was even cheaper. It was down to around 21, 22 cents a gallon, if you can imagine that. And I remember going into Richfield stations. There used to be Richfield gas stations a long time ago. Uh, by 1919, about two-thirds of California's oil actually came from the San Joaquin Valley's oil fields. The major refineries at that time were concentrated up in the San Francisco Bay Area, but things changed in the 1920s as Southern California became predominant in all aspects of the oil industry, with new discoveries in places like Huntington Beach, Santa Fe Springs, and especially a big oil discovery in an area of Long Beach known as Signal Hill. I actually think it is a separate city from Long Beach. If you know Long Beach and you drive, say, like I think on Atlantic Boulevard and you go inland, toward where the Long Beach Airport is, you approach a big hill as you go inland, and that is Signal Hill. I went to college a long time ago at San Jose State with a guy who was one of my roommates, a guy named Will Sampson. And his family were actually chicken farmers on Signal Hill at about the time that oil was discovered there. So there's an interesting personal story to this. At this point in time, the LA harbor was the biggest oil export harbor in the world. The value of oil produced in California in the 1920s was about equal to the value of all the gold extracted in the gold rush in California the century before, around $2 billion. Uh, Oil became the number one industry in California, surpassing the canning and preserving industry, which was, before oil became a boom thing, the biggest industry in California. So in comes the automobile. Uh, Initially, the market for all these refined oil products was for steamships or ships and locomotives, which had been switched from coal to oil. Gasoline was a useless byproduct of refining crude oil for other products that were sold. So at this same time, you can call it a coincidence if you want, but there are people that will say there are no coincidences. Things happen for a reason. This is when the Ford Model T came off the assembly line in mass production, and it was cheap enough for Americans to buy a car. A few $100s, I think. Um, so the race was on to build roads that could accommodate automobiles because roads at that time were for carriages carried by horses, and there was mud and rocks and so on. So at this time, about 1900, two private organizations formed in California to promote the building of good roads. The Automobile Club of Southern California, based in LA, and the California State Automobile Association, based in San Francisco. These two organizations exist today. They are affiliated with AAA, okay, American Automobile Association, and it's highly probable that your parents have purchased for you a AAA emergency road card. You look in your wallet, you probably have it, and these organizations still exist today. In 1909, Californians went to the ballot box and passed a bond issue, a modest one by our standards, of $18 million to start a system of paved roads and highways. Following that, the Federal Highway Aid Act of 1916 provided dollar matching grants to the states. The gasoline tax became the major revenue source for roads, and this is a very, very fair tax. In California, we complain about it a lot. We can complain all we want, but the truth of the matter is, it's a user pay situation. If you drive a car and fill up your tank with gas, you're going to pay a gas tax. If you don't drive a car and don't get gasoline, well, then you're not going to pay a gas tax. So it's a fair tax in its purest form. Use the roads, you pay for their maintenance and building. By 1925, Los Angeles had one car for every three people, more than twice the national average. And this is most important. LA was the first major U.S. city in which the major expansion came entirely within the automobile era. That led to the expansion of suburbs with single family residences and low population density followed. People could live farther and farther away from the workplace. So, the seeds of today's congestion in Southern California have been sown at this point. If you've driven down there lately. Southern California and therefore America would never be the same. Now, I'm going to fast forward to the modern era. A recent study, which I read about only, briefly, in another textbook about California, which is called Rediscovering the Golden State by William Selby, third edition. He cited one study that indicated that at peak commute time in the greater metro LA area, 77% of the vehicles are one person in one car. And let me tell you something, that is not sustainable. The other industry is, of course, motion pictures, the movies. In the early 1900s, the epicenter of the movie industry was the East Coast, New York, New Jersey. Thomas Edison's company and a few other companies held the patents on cameras and projectors. Pirate movie makers sprang up and moved to other parts of the country to avoid patent lawsuits. You see, they were not allowed by law to use Edison's cameras. Initially, the movie industry went to Chicago, and then eventually by 1907 it went to Los Angeles. The Bronco Billy Westerns of 1908, all silent films at this point, were shot in the area of Niles Canyon, which is in Alameda County, southeast of Oakland. The LA suburb of Hollywood became a popular place for the movie industry as it popped up in California because if East Coast process servers came with papers to sue independent movie companies who were using Edison's cameras and others, the companies could easily pack those cameras up into a car and drive across the Mexican border and could not be found. Obviously, the other favorable thing about California is that we had a variety of landscapes for movie shooting and production and also good weather. Um, in 1900, there was also a strike of vaudeville actors. This prompted theaters to feature programs of movies. This was profitable for theater owners who only charged a nickel for people to get in to see the silent movies of the time. Now, initially, potential investors in the movie industry shunned them as an investment because poor people went to see the movies, not the affluent. So these, stuffy investors said, well, we don't want to invest in these because this is where poor people go for entertainment. A Polish Jewish American scholar and scriptwriter, Leo Kostin, observed that, quote, the men who built the motion picture industry were from the marginal and shabby zones of enterprise, many from Eastern Europe. So a lot of Jews from Eastern Europe actually are the ones who built the movie industry in California. Um, and the independent filmmakers of that day developed what we now call the star system, where certain actors worked for certain studios repeatedly in new movies because the public wanted to see them. They were favorite actors and actresses of the public. Films became entertainment from the middle classes eventually. Theater owners built large palaces like Grauman's Chinese Theater on Sunset Boulevard in LA. Here's a picture of it from 1943. I think this is from the Academy Awards of that year. The themes of movies began to shift from mostly rural themes to urban themes, and of course, talking movies came in 1927. And by 1941, there were more movie theaters than banks in the United States. It should also be noted that one particular silent movie made in this era, which is called Birth of a Nation, is a very controversial movie because it purportedly portrayed the history of the United States, but only in terms of white Americans, and it was extremely exploitive. It did not properly tell the story of American slavery. So that's something that people continue to study today. And there you have the New Industries of California, Chapter 23.